Amparo's soles had not set another place at her table in 11 years. She kept the extra chair anyway, pushed against the wall where the dust could settle on it undisturbed. Because taking it away would have meant admitting the house was never going to be full again. The house itself sat on the edge of Oaxaca de las Rosas, 3 rooms of thick adobe walls, and a courtyard with a dry stone fountain that hadn't run water since before her daughter died. Its cracked basin now home to nothing but weeds and a few brave marigolds that came back every autumn, whether anyone tended them or not. The neighbors had grown used to seeing Amparo's shutters closed by early evening, her lamp the only light on the street, by full dark, and had long since stopped expecting anything different from the widow at the corner house. Rain was coming down hard the evening a stranger knocked. A man with 2 small children pressed close against his legs, and a suitcase that looked like it had been packed in a hurry by someone who didn't quite know what a family needs. Amparo opened the door only because the knocking wouldn't stop, and found herself looking at a face she half recognized from the market. Ernesto Vidal, the widower everyone in the pueblo spoke about in careful, pitying tones since his wife had died the winter before. "Señora Soles," he said, water running off the brim of his hat, "I know it's a strange hour, and I know we're strangers to you, but the room I was renting flooded an hour ago, and I have nowhere else in this town I can bring them tonight." Amparo looked past him at the 2 children, a girl of about 7 with her father's same tired eyes, and a boy barely old enough to walk steadily, both soaked through and shivering. She had turned away plenty of things in 11 years. She had never quite managed to turn away a cold child. "Come in before you all catch your death," she said, stepping back from the door, and told herself it was only for the night. She crossed herself quietly as she latched the door behind them, the way her mother had taught her to do whenever she let strangers under her roof. Because you never know, Hijau, which stranger God has sent you on purpose. It was not only for the night. By the 2nd week, Ernesto had found no landlord in the pueblo willing to rent to a man with 2 young children and a reputation, fair or not, for bad luck. And Amparo had stopped bringing up the subject of when they'd be leaving, because the house had begun to smell like bread again in the mornings, and she had forgotten how much she'd missed that smell. "You're alone in this big house, Señora, and my children have never had a grandmother," Ernesto said one evening, standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands like a man asking for something far larger than what he was actually asking. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll work. I'll fix what needs fixing. I'll pay what I can. I'm only asking you to let us stay." Amparo had buried a husband 9 years earlier and a daughter 2 years before that, in a fever that took her within a week. And the house she lived in, inherited from her own mother, 3 rooms and a courtyard with a dry fountain that hadn't run water since before the daughter died, had been echoing with nothing but her own footsteps ever since. She looked at Ernesto a long moment, and then at the little girl watching from behind his leg with an expression too solemn for a child her age. "On one condition," Amparo said finally, "you stop calling me Señora. In this house you'll call me what the children will call me, or not at all." What none of them yet understood, not Amparo, not Ernesto, and certainly not the children, was that a small wooden horse buried at the bottom of an old trunk in the back room was going to matter a great deal more than anyone in that house could have guessed. And that a nephew Amparo hadn't spoken to in 3 years already had papers drawn up in Oaxaca City that would try to take the house out from under all of them before the year was through. The mornings changed shape almost immediately. Amparo woke before the children now, lit the wood stove, and had the coffee going by the time little Anna came padding into the kitchen in bare feet. Always first. Always hungry for conversation more than food. The boy Toms was too young yet for much beyond babbling and reaching for whatever was closest. But he took to falling asleep against Ampero's shoulder in the afternoons, with a trust that undid something in her she'd thought long since closed over. By the third week, a routine had settled over the house that none of them spoke of directly, but all of them protected. Coffee and bread before dawn. Ernesto out to whatever repair waited that day. Ana trailing Amparo through her chores, asking questions faster than they could be answered. And every evening, before supper, a small blessing Amparo insisted on saying over the table, the same one her own mother had said, word for word, in that same kitchen, decades before. "You don't have to hold him every time he fusses," Ernesto told her once, a little embarrassed, watching her pace the courtyard with the boy against her chest. "I know I don't have to," Amparo said. "I want to." There's a difference, and you'll understand it again someday, when you stop being so afraid of taking anything from anyone. Sundays, the whole household walked together to the small church at the center of town, Ana's hand in Amparo's, Tom's riding on his father's shoulders. And though the neighbors' eyes followed them the entire way, Amparo found she minded it less each week. Father Daman, who had said the funeral mass for both her husband and her daughter, took to greeting them by name from the pulpit steps, and made a point, more than once, of telling Amparo that a house with children's laughter in it again was its own kind of answered prayer. "You look 10 years younger since that man and his children came to your door," the old priest told her one Sunday, walking with her as far as the churchyard gate. God has a strange sense of timing, but he rarely gets it wrong. "I used to think he'd forgotten this house entirely," Amparo admitted. "I'm not so sure of that anymore." Ernesto worked with his hands from morning until dark, repairing the fountain's cracked basin, replacing rotted shutters, clearing 11 years of neglect from the courtyard garden until the bougainvillea Amparo's mother had planted decades earlier began, astonishingly, to bloom again. In the evenings, Ana would sit at Amparo's feet while the old woman told her stories about a girl who used to live in that same house long ago. A girl who'd had a favorite hiding spot behind the kitchen, and a laugh that could be heard 3 houses down. "Was she your little girl?" Ana asked one evening, with the unflinching directness only children manage. "She was," Amparo said, and didn't look away from the fire. "Her name was Rosario. She would have liked you very much." The town noticed, of course, because towns always notice, and not everyone in Oaxaca de las Rosas cared for what they saw. A widow living alone with a stranger and his children, unmarried, unrelated by blood. The talk started at the well and traveled from there the way talk always does, gathering weight it hadn't earned. "People are saying things they have no right to say," Ernesto told Amparo one afternoon, jaw tight with an anger he was trying to keep from his voice. "About you. About what kind of man takes in an old woman's house like this." "Let them say what they need to say," Amparo answered, not looking up from the beans she was sorting. "I buried a husband and a daughter in this town, and not one of those tongues wagging at the well brought me so much as a plate of food in the 2 years after Rosario died. I've earned the right not to care what they think of me now." Not everyone in the pueblo whispered, though. Doa Consuelo, who ran the corner store and had known Amparo's mother, began sending Ana home with a piece of candy for being such a good helper, and the schoolteacher, noticing how quickly the girl had settled into her lessons, told Amparo privately that whatever the well had to say, the child was clearly better cared for now than she had been in the months right after her mother's death. But it was not only the town's opinion that Amparo would soon have to answer for. Word reached her nephew Prudencio, her late husband's sister's son, a man who'd left for the capital 15 years earlier and returned to the pueblo only twice since, both times when there was money to be discussed, that his aunt had taken strangers into her house, and Prudencio, who had long assumed that same house would fall to him whenever Amparo finally died, did not take the news calmly. He arrived without warning on a Sunday afternoon, dressed like a man who wanted the whole street to notice his good coat, and did not bother with pleasantries. He'd left the pueblo at 19 for the capital, and every visit since had followed the same pattern. A few days of forced warmth, questions about the house's condition disguised as concern for his aunt's health, and a departure that always seemed to coincide with some conversation about money. "Ta, we need to talk about your affairs," Prudencio said, glancing at Ernesto with open suspicion as the man came in from the courtyard, dirt still on his hands from the garden. "People are saying you're not thinking clearly anymore. Letting strangers into Uncle Fabin's house. It isn't safe. It isn't right. This house was my mother's before it was your uncle's," Amparo said evenly, "and it will remain mine until I decide otherwise. I think clearly enough to know exactly who's welcome at my table and who isn't. I only want what's best for you," Prudencio said, in a tone that made even Ana, watching from the doorway, take a step back toward her father. "You never once asked what was best for me while I was alone in this house for 11 years, Amparo said, her voice still level, though something in it had sharpened. "Not a letter, not a visit at Christmas. Not so much as a candle lit for your uncle on the anniversary of his death. Forgive me if I find your sudden concern difficult to trust." Prudencio's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more that day. Only cast one last look around the courtyard, at the newly cleared garden, the half-repaired fountain, the general signs of a house coming back to life, before taking his leave with a promise, more threat than farewell, that he'd be in touch soon about the paperwork. What none of them knew yet was that what was best for Prudencio had already been drawn up, weeks earlier, in a lawyer's office in Oaxaca City, in the shape of a document granting him power over his aunt's affairs on the grounds of diminished capacity, a document that needed only Amparo's signature, or, failing that, the signature of 2 witnesses willing to swear she could no longer manage on her own. 2 days later, a young clerk arrived from the city carrying that very paper, along with a note from a Dr. Amparo had never once met, attesting to a mental decline he had never once observed. Ernesto met the clerk at the gate before the young man could even knock, read through both documents twice with the careful, suspicious attention of a man who had learned the hard way not to trust paperwork that arrived too neatly folded, and asked the clerk to leave copies rather than take Amparo's signature that day. "Something about this doesn't sit right," Ernesto told Amparo that evening, spreading both papers on the kitchen table under the lamp. "This doctor's name, I don't recognize it, and I've lived near enough to this town's clinic long enough to know most of the names that come out of it." "Prudencio never was a patient man," Amparo said, turning the paper over in her hands. "But I didn't think he was a foolish one either. This is either very bold or very desperate." It was Ernesto who noticed, reading the note a third time, that the doctor's signature didn't match any name on the town's own clinic registry, a fact he confirmed the following morning with a visit to the clinic itself, and it was Ana, 3 days after that, who found the wooden horse. She'd been playing in the back room where an old trunk of Rosario's things had sat untouched for years, and pulled it out from under a folded blanket, worn smooth at the mane from years of small hands. "Whose is this?" Ana asked, carrying it out to where Amparo sat mending a shirt. Amparo's hands went still on the needle. "It was Rosario's," she said quietly. "Her father carved it for her the year she turned 5. She never once let it out of her sight, not even to sleep." "Can I hold it?" Ana asked, and something in the careful, hopeful way she asked made Amparo's chest tighten. "You can do more than hold it," Amparo said, turning the small horse over in her own hands first, running her thumb along a groove in its underside that she'd forgotten was even there, a seam that didn't quite match the rest of the carving. Her fingers paused. "Wait. Give me a moment," Hija, tucked into the horse's hollowed underside, wrapped in a scrap of cloth gone brittle with age, was a folded paper Amparo had forgotten existed. A letter from her husband Faben, written the year before he died, naming her, in his own hand and before a notary whose seal was still legible, sole and unconditional owner of the house, free of any claim from nephews, in-laws, or distant relations, so that no one may ever tell her she does not belong in her own home. He knew, Amparo whispered, reading it twice, her hands trembling now in a way they hadn't since the day she'd buried him. He knew Prudencio would try something like this one day. He always did see further than the rest of us. Faben carved that horse himself, and hid this inside it himself, and never once told me. He must have known that if he told me while he was alive, I would have worried myself sick, wondering when the day would come. Ana, watching Amparo's face, reached out and patted her hand the way she'd seen her father do for her when she was frightened, and Amparo found herself laughing through sudden tears at the small, solemn gesture. "Thank you for finding this, mi amor," Amparo said. "You have no idea what you just handed me." Ernesto took both documents, the letter and the fraudulent power of attorney paper, to the same clerk's office in Oaxaca City the following week, along with the town's own doctor, who confirmed within minutes that the attesting physician's name did not exist on any medical registry in the state. The forged declaration was voided before the ink on Prudencio's copy had even finished drying. When Prudencio arrived again, this time with the lawyer who had drawn up his papers trailing uneasily behind him, Amparo was waiting on the courtyard bench with Faben's letter in her lap, and Ernesto standing, arms crossed, by the gate. She had asked Doa Consuelo and Father Daman both to be present as well, so that whatever is said today is said in front of witnesses who actually know this family, and neither had hesitated to come. "This is fraud, and everyone in this town will know it by nightfall," Ernesto said, before Prudencio could get past his first sentence. "A doctor who doesn't exist, signing a decline he never witnessed. You should be grateful your aunt is only asking you to leave, and not asking the police to do it for her. You don't speak for this family," Prudencio snapped, though his eyes had already gone to the folded letter in Amparo's lap, and something in his face suggested he recognized, even before she said a word, exactly what it must contain. "I don't need to," Amparo said, rising slowly from the bench, Faben's letter still in her hand. "Faben spoke for it 15 years ago, and he knew you better than you'd like to admit. You never once came to see if I was lonely, Prudencio. You only ever came to see if I was dying yet." "That isn't fair," Prudencio said, though the protest came out weaker than he clearly meant it to. "Fair would have been a letter, once, asking how I was managing alone," Amparo said. "Fair would have been showing up at Rosario's grave even once in the 2 years I visited it by myself. This isn't about fairness, Prudencio. This is about a document with a forged doctor's name on it, and you know it better than anyone standing in this courtyard." The lawyer, already pale, mumbled something about a misunderstanding and turned back toward the street without waiting for Prudencio to follow. Father Daman said nothing at all, but the quiet, disappointed way he looked at Prudencio carried more weight in that courtyard than any accusation could have. Two neighbors who'd stopped to watch from across the road exchanged a look that traveled to the well faster than any gossip Ernesto had ever complained about. And by the following Sunday, it was Prudencio's name, and not Amparo's, that the town spoke of in careful, judging tones. Prudencio left without another word, and this time, when his footsteps faded down the street, no one in that courtyard felt the need to watch him go. Months later, when the rains passed and the bougainvillea Amparo's mother had planted spilled thick and pink over the courtyard wall, the fountain ran water again for the first time in over a decade, restored stone by Ernesto's hands. Ana had taken to keeping Rosario's wooden horse on her own windowsill. "So she can see the garden too," she told Amparo solemnly, and Amparo had not had the heart nor the wish to correct her. On a warm Sunday afternoon, with the courtyard table set for 4 and the smell of fresh bread drifting out past the gate, neighbors who had once whispered at the well now stopped by instead with baskets of fruit, and no excuse needed beyond wanting to sit a while. Doa Consuelo brought a jar of her own mango preserves, and Father Damon, stopping by on his way home from Mass, blessed the table before anyone touched the bread, the way he'd taken to doing every visit since. Toms, walking steadily now, chased a chicken across the courtyard while Ana narrated the whole pursuit to anyone who would listen. And Ernesto, watching Amparo laugh at something the girl said, found himself thinking that his wife, wherever she was, would have liked this house very much. The schoolteacher stopped by too that afternoon, mentioning in passing that Ana had asked, unprompted, whether she could bring her grandmother to the school's harvest festival next month, and Amparo had needed a moment before she could answer that of course she'd come. Of course, nothing could keep her away. "Do you still feel alone in this big house?" Ernesto asked her that evening as they sat together by the restored fountain, the water catching the last gold light of the day. "I haven't felt alone since the night I let 3 cold strangers in out of the rain," Amparo said. "I only thought I was doing you a kindness. I didn't understand yet that you were doing me the greater one. If God sent you to my door that night, he chose his hour well. I was closer to giving up on this house mattering to anyone than I ever admitted, even to myself." Ana came running out just then with the wooden horse in her hand, breathless, to show Amparo a beetle she'd found in the garden, and Amparo took the horse from her without thinking, turning it over once in her palm before setting it gently on the courtyard ledge. In a place of honor where the evening light would always reach it first, Toms toddled after his sister a moment later, demanding to see the beetle too, and for a while the courtyard was full of nothing but children's arguing, and the sound of water finally moving through stone that had sat dry for far too long. Sometimes the family we are given is not the one that saves us, and the family that does save us walks in soaked from the rain, with nothing to offer but 2 cold children and an honest request. Loneliness does not always end the way we expect it to. Sometimes it ends with someone else's children calling you abuela, and meaning it. Has someone ever asked you for shelter and ended up giving you a home in return, in a way you never saw coming? If this story touched something in your heart, leave your comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next story. Share it with someone who has ever felt like they were facing their loneliest years alone. Thank you for staying with us until the end, and until the next story. Years later, Amparo would tell anyone who asked that the best decision of her life was answering a door she almost didn't open, on a night when the rain gave her every reason to pretend she hadn't heard the knock at all.